Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see that there are such vast multitudes of people here. Actually, there's more people here than could be here, considering that it's break and that everybody here likes to get out of here when it's break, it seems. There's actually not too few of us here this morning. Let's start out with a word of prayer before we get into the lesson. If you'll just bow your heads with me. Our Father in heaven, Lord, I thank you so much for bringing us together, giving us this time that we can come together and study your word. Discuss not only its meaning, but its implications for us and our lives today. And I want to pray that as we do so, you will fill us with your Holy Spirit, that you will fill us with your love and with your wisdom. We thank you and pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Before we begin, I want to ask for a volunteer who's willing to tote a microphone around. Is there anyone who is willing to? Thank you so much. Now, as you can see, because there's not a lot of us, that means the few of us that are here have to say a whole lot more in order for it to be an interesting discussion. Is that fair? I'm going to take that as a no. What are we going to have to do to make that fair? Do we have to pass out candy to everyone that participates or something? Everybody's just nope, not even candy would do it. Okay, tell me, what are your terms? Okay, we're just going to get started. So the lesson this week talks a little bit about the story of Ezra and Nehemiah dealing with the fact that in Israel, after the captivity, there were a lot of idolatrous and heathen relationships going on. And it talks about how they deal with those relationships in such a way as to preserve the specific and important truths of the nation of Israel, and specifically to preserve the identity of Israel. And the first lesson talks about how these spouses did not speak the language of Israel. After the children of Israel came back from captivity, the Hebrew language was dying, and other languages were gaining prominence among the children of Israel. Now, it's kind of hard today to make a case that one language is objectively better than another. It's kind of hard to say that, English is the language of God or Spanish is the language of God. But I think there are some parallels that we can pull out of this story to apply to our lives today. So before we start reading about it, I want us just to have that in the back of our mind, asking ourselves, what are some parallels we can pull out of this story, even though there's no direct correlation, because we don't have Hebrew as a common language. We don't have a language that is directly tied to the Bible. But what are some parallels that we can pull out of this story for how our language today, how our vocabulary today can be affected by the culture around us, can be affected by heathenism? Let's turn to the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 23 through 25. And who would like to read that for us? Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 23 through 25. Thank you so much.
In those days, I also saw Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod and could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke according to the language of one or the other people. So I contended with them and cursed them, struck some of them, and pulled out their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, You shall not give your daughters as wives to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or yourselves.
This is a pretty strong reaction to intermarriage. Nehemiah is saying that he specifically punished some of these people who were intermarrying with the surrounding tribes. And one of the specific reasons that is brought out in Scripture here is that half of them spoke the language of Ashdod and could not speak the language of the Jews. I have quite a few things in mind that I think could be applications of that today for us, but I want to hear what you guys think. Any thoughts? In what ways could our language as Adventists, our language as Christians, be influenced by the culture, or in what ways can we influence the culture through our speech? Any thoughts? Right here. Excuse me.
I think one important thing that I learned as I was studying this week was that the incidents in Ezra that we're going to read about later in the lesson happened before this, maybe even 30 years before. So here is the second time this problem has come up. And I think one of the important things about language at that time was that they only had the scriptures in the Hebrew language. So that meant that the children, and you know, they used to gather everyone together at least once a year and read scriptures. Well, that would mean that the wives and the children couldn't hear that.
Right, right.
And that was an important part because they didn't have the written scriptures like we have. So I think an application to us is that we all need to make sure we understand the scriptures for ourselves and not neglect them. We have them. We have them in our own language. And we need to be reading the scriptures for ourselves.
You know, and you bring up a really pertinent point, and that is that in that context, language and what language was used was especially relevant because that was the only language in which the scriptures were written. And if you did not speak that language, if you weren't able to read and to study and to hear the scriptures for yourself, then really you couldn't be a true follower of God. Any other thoughts on how language can affect culture, culture can affect language, language and culture can affect Christianity, Christianity can affect language and culture, all of that? Any other thoughts? You know, it's really interesting how deeply connected our language is to the way we think about the world. Those of us who have studied a second language or learned to speak a second language understand this probably better than those of us who only speak one language, because when you start to learn a second language, you realize that you actually tend to think in a language. When you start to learn, for example, I've learned Spanish. When you start to learn Spanish, you start to realize, wow, I think in English, and then when I go to talk in Spanish, I have to translate it and then talk in Spanish, right? And then if I've been in an area where I'm speaking Spanish a lot, all of a sudden I start to think a little bit mixed in Spanish and English, and it gets really confusing. You know, we tend to think in a language. We don't just think in abstract terms. And so language is actually quite central to the essence of who we are and to the essence of how we think about reality and how we think about religion. And so if one can control the language that a group of people speak, if one can define the vocabulary that a group of people use, then that person can also control the culture and the theology of that group, at least to a certain extent. So let's think about some examples of that happening in more recent history. So I'm going to share a few examples, and if you have some you want to add, that'd be great. So one example that comes to my mind is the way the Christian world has been led to think about Sunday versus Sabbath. Instead of those who wanted to change the day of worship to the first day of the week, instead of them arguing for why it would be better to worship on Sunday, they started renaming Sunday as, for example, the Lord's Day. And when you define Sunday as the Lord's Day, then all of a sudden it sounds really important. It sounds like a day that we should honor. It sounds like a day that we should reverence. And when you simply manipulate language, you are able to avoid the intellectual rigor that is needed to bring in a new concept, idea, or theological tenet. So instead of simply arguing for the importance of Sunday worship, if instead you simply label Sunday as the Lord's Day or a holy day or a special day, then all of a sudden it starts to sound important, and you've done nothing to argue for the importance of Sunday. I have a couple more examples, but I want to hear if you guys have any examples of where people have manipulated language to lead to an unbiblical result.
Well, one time that there was at least an attempt to do that was with Daniel and his 3 friends, who, as soon as they were taken off to Babylon, were renamed from Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where their names were changed to be praising the foreign gods. In that case, it did not work, but we can postulate that the same thing happened to a lot of the other Hebrews that were taken off, and seemingly it did work in those cases.
Interesting. Other examples of where language has been used to manipulate theology, or someone's tried to use it to manipulate theology. Another example that comes to my mind, it comes from more modern times, and that is how some within the culture have tried to reinterpret and redefine gender and sexuality. Instead of arguing from biology or from some deep scientific foundation that really there is no biological foundation for what your gender is, in other words, that you are whatever gender you feel to be, instead of arguing for that, those within our culture who want that to be reality have simply said, your gender is whatever you make of it. Your gender is whatever you feel it to be. And by doing so, they've avoided the necessary defense of their point, simply by changing the definition of words. Truth, okay? Explain.
Well, they've been talking about whether it's your truth or my truth or the truth, and we
Right.
all have our own truth,
Right.
and therefore they can assert their beliefs upon our system, and it's supposed to sound reasonable.
Yeah, absolutely. So what they're doing there is they're manipulating the definition of truth. They're saying that truth is no longer absolute, but rather truth is some sort of jello relative, who knows what it is. And when you define it in such a way, then all of a sudden, truth loses its meaning. Any other examples of how language can be manipulated to change theological ideas?
I think one thing we need to remember, we need to remember that we have names for each day of the week.
Right, right.
Sunday, that's the sun's day.
Mm-hmm.
Monday, that's the moon's day.
Right.
And when you go down, and each one is named after a different planet or whatever.
Right, right.
And lo and behold, you come to Sabbath. That's embarrassing to the Sunday keepers who've been told that Sunday's the Lord's Day, should be at least, because, I've been always told, no. As a minister, I always made it a point to get on the ministerial association.
Okay.
And in the last place where I was, one minister in the Methodist church, he said, "Oh, I never thought of that. Sun's Day, Moon's Day, my. I never heard of that before."
Mm-hmm.
And wow, it got them to thinking. Keep this thought before people, that's what these days are called after. Not what God called them. God called them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Wow, God.
6 was preparation.
It's true. It's true. You know, and I think what you bring out is an example of what we're about to get to, and that is how Christian language can be used to influence the culture. What we've been talking about is how the culture has tried to use language to manipulate Christianity, and what you're bringing out is a way in which language can be used to positively influence us and the culture. But before we get to that, any other thoughts on, right here.
Yeah, so another recent time example, not in this country, but we see a similar thing going on with the Uyghurs in China, where they are being taken to be re-educated, which
Yes.
part of that re-education has to do with speaking Chinese, not speaking the other languages, as well as doing away with their religious beliefs.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very true. And I feel like that example is kind of pregnant on two levels, in that not only are these re-education camps trying to strip them of their Muslim heritage through a change in language, but also even the name re-education camp doesn't completely entail the negativity that these camps actually have. If they were called concentration camps, I think we would all be a little more concerned, but they're just re-education camps. So, who cares? We all need to be educated, and why not let them be educated too? Are you bigoted? So I think it's important on two levels that yes, they're not only training them in a new language, but they're labeling it such that it doesn't sound as bad as it actually is. Dr. Fadidis?
Well, it's actually what you're bringing about is very serious because it dictates the whole of theology. Many people do it probably ignorantly. Others will just manipulate those languages to be able to distort the truth. You have the case of, for instance, wine, whereby people will say, you can drink, but actually without paying attention to the use of that word, wine, in the original languages, even though they know, but they do that, which is oinos or yain, which can refer to fermented or non-fermented. Now, there is something very interesting when you talk about people who want to disbelieve the inspiration of the first part of the Bible, like the first books of, the 5 books of Moses, especially the part that talks about creation, whereby they will say, no, actually God didn't create. This account of creation itself came from the Babylonian account of creation. In other words, Moses didn't have any revelation from God, he didn't have any knowledge, but they tried to see some of the words in the book of Genesis, like tehom, which is a Hebrew word, in the very first verse that the Spirit of God was moving upon the surface of the water, and it was empty. And they see Tehom as Tiamat, which is the god of Babylon, which was moving, controlling. And so Moses copied, he transformed a little bit, but everything was actually from the Babylonian account of creation. So language is really seriously used actually to distort the truth, as you are saying. And the knowledge of it, or the right use of it, can help people to know who God is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fadidis. And, I think you bring out a good point, and that is not only can language within English, for example, since that's the common language around here, not only can that be manipulated, but it's possible to misunderstand the original languages of the Scripture, and that's why it's important that we have scholars like Dr. Fadidis who can help us to not be confused by things like that. Any other thoughts on how language can be misused?
It's a China. We using kanji is a Chinese character. The Korean, Japanese, Taiwanese, and Chinese. And when the cultural revolution was happened, the Mao did one in China. Anyway, so what he did is simplify the Chinese character, and we can guess what they're talking, but it's not real one. It's really simplified. And Taiwanese and Japanese still using the old Chinese character, and we can explain the Genesis and Noah's Ark and creation, all the stories in the Chinese character. We can tell, but the Chinese new language cannot tell. anything, the creation, the Noah's Ark, and everything wiped away because of that. Yeah, that's the history.
Interesting, interesting. So not only is the original creation account built into those language symbols, but then I guess what you're saying is somebody came in and tried to do away with that such that you couldn't tell the creation story. Interesting. One other example, unless there's any others from you guys, one other example that comes to my mind is how we have allowed the culture to define religion in a very narrow sense. We've allowed the culture to define religion as basically traditional monotheistic faiths and everything else as some sort of fact. So basically, if you're a Christian, your worldview is based solely off of speculation and faith. But if you're a secular person, then your worldview is not religious, it's based off of fact. And oh, by the way, we don't want any combination of church and state, so we don't want Christianity to in any way influence the government, but secularism can influence the government. You know, we can teach evolution in schools because that's all based off of fact. That's not part of religion. We've allowed the definition of religion to be, narrowed so small that a lot of actually faith-based stuff like evolution, for example, can be incorporated into our system of government and into our educational system. Just one more example that came to mind when I was thinking about how language can be manipulated to serve the purposes of someone who doesn't want to go through the rigors of defending their point of view. But getting back to the lesson, we have this story, and my computer just turned off, or actually went to sleep. See if I can wake it up. We have this story of Nehemiah and Ezra working to restore the identity and the language to the people of Israel. And as they're trying to do this, they take some pretty drastic steps. Several drastic steps. Let's read verse 25 again, and then we'll talk about that a little bit. Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 25. If someone can read that for us.
So I contended with them and cursed them and struck some of them and pulled out their hair and made them swear by God, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take of their daughters for your sons or for yourselves.
That's pretty intense. And a lot of what the lesson does this week is actually provide running cover for the Bible, it would seem, trying to defend the actions of Nehemiah taken here. But we're not going to spend a lot of time with that, but I do want to touch on it briefly. What does it mean that he struck some of them and plucked out their hair? And it sounds like he just got mad and went on this rampage. What do you guys think? What does this seem to be talking about when it says that he beat some of the men and pulled out their hair in response to this cultural problem? Any thoughts? Was Nehemiah just getting angry here and, running around and creating havoc? Or was this some sort of more orderly type of incident?
Like I said before, this is the second time that this has happened since their return from Babylon to Israel. And the thing is that they were put into captivity for their idolatry, for their allowing the religions of the area to infiltrate Israel instead of staying true to God. And I think that both Ezra and Nehemiah saw this as, we see it in Ezra's prayer. Oh my God, we were in captivity as we were told we would be in the curses of Deuteronomy. And then God was so faithful to us that he returned us to our homeland. What a wonderful thing that God did for us. And now we're slapping him in the face and going right back to where we were before. I mean, this was serious to them. It meant we're going to lose the blessing of God. We are going to maybe lose our inheritance here. It was very serious to both Ezra and Nehemiah.
Yeah, and to that point, before we really get into what exactly happened here, I think that's a very key point to keep in mind is just imagine being either Ezra or Nehemiah in this situation. You've worked and sacrificed to bring the children of Israel back into a position of greatness, into a position of being the people who God wanted them to be. And you also, as was mentioned, you know the history. You know that they were put into captivity and that they lost a lot of their power and a lot of their identity because of idolatry, because of intermarriage with the heathens. And with all of this background, then you're looking around and you're seeing, wow, half the kids don't even speak the language in which the Torah is written. I think any one of us in that situation, in that context, would be highly troubled, would be highly perturbed. Any other thoughts on that? Any other thoughts on right here?
I'm not sure, but it's more a question. Slapping them and pulling their hair actually was a way of dishonoring, showing dishonor to them. I think that was the intent, not necessarily physical punishment.
Right. And that's actually a point that the lesson brings out as well, is that this doesn't, within the cultural context, doesn't seem to be some sort of rampage that Nehemiah goes on and just goes around running through the church, slapping people and pulling their hair. It seems to be more of a targeted punishment on the leaders, because once again it says that he did this to some of them and not all of them. It seems to be a more targeted public punishment that was in keeping with the culture and with the types of punishments that were meted out in that day. That's what the lesson seems to say. Now, I don't have a whole lot of evidence for that, apart from that the lesson claims it. If anyone of our wonderful scholars here wants to add some evidence for that, that would be wonderful. But I think it sounds pretty fair. The context doesn't seem to be indicating that Nehemiah was just angry, running around slapping people. Any thoughts on that? Dr. Fadidis?
Well, I would actually suggest that he probably did, because even the very fact that you are telling people to, you are dismissing people from the congregation of Israel, it doesn't fit our culture today.
Right.
You don't do it. So what they did was right, proper to their culture, but not to ours. It was a patriarchal system where the leaders is to be, by the way, he's not going to be changed. We're not going to sit down tomorrow and vote for another one. He is our leader, and he's got to make a decision. He doesn't need a group of 50 people, the whole parliament or Senate that's going to sit and make a decision. So that was right. But the lesson I want to learn from this, what happened is that actually there is indignation. I'm not happy with what you're doing.
Right.
And that can happen today as well. There are things, of course, we're not going to react maybe as he did, but there is a proper reaction also for us as people of God when we see things happening which shouldn't be happening today. There is a way we can react to tell people that, no, this is not the right way, and so you've got to change your ways of doing. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you bring out a good point, and that is it's highly unpopular to have any kind of negative reaction to anything that somebody else is doing these days, it seems. Like if you have a negative emotional or intellectual response to an idea or to a lifestyle or something that's highly unpopular, but as you're saying, sometimes that's needed. Sometimes we need to be troubled by sin. Sometimes we need to let sin bother us, and if it's not bothering us, maybe there's something wrong. Any other thoughts on this?
Well, when you were just going through that, I was thinking to myself that any mother would have to raise her voice, or any father would have to maybe exert a stronger punishment for a child that runs out into the street. And they didn't seem to have a sensibility for what they were doing that was actually destroying the unity of the faith in Israel, right? I mean, it just seems like they were, like you said, going backwards, and that was threatening the whole unity of what God was trying to do through them and for them.
Right. And it's also, we'll come to you in just a moment, it's also important to remember that you didn't have to stay a part of the children of Israel. If you were not interested in being part of the religion of the Israelites or part of the culture of the Israelites, you could leave. There was no prohibition on that. But if you wanted to stay, if you wanted to be part of this specific religious group, then you had to adhere to the rules, you had to forward the culture, all of that.
I was just going to emphasize again how important and how deeply related the language was to the culture and the worship. You could not worship God in a different language at that time. Each tribe worshipped their own gods, and their own gods were related to their culture and to their worship. So the bottom line, it was not a language issue, it was an worship issue.
That is actually a very good point, and that is in that day, as you're saying, different languages were directly linked to different styles of worship, and were actually kind of built around the mythology and the theology of those different worship patterns. And so to incorporate another language was, at least to some extent, to incorporate the thought processes of that other religion. Very good point. Any other thoughts on this before we move on? If not, let's move on to verse 26 and verse 27. This is kind of the rebuke that Nehemiah gives to the children of Israel because they've intermarried. Verse 26 and 27, I'll read it. It says, "Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations was there no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over Israel. Nevertheless, even him did outlandish women cause to sin. Shall we then hearken unto you to do all this great evil, to transgress against our God in marrying strange wives?" So notice what Nehemiah does here. He not only calls out the sin and says, this is wrong, that we're corrupting our culture, that we're corrupting our language, that we're corrupting our religion. He not only does that, but he gives an example and he gives a solid argument for why this is dangerous. And what is that argument? That argument is from the life of Solomon. So my question is, why is the life of Solomon such a good example of the dangers of intermarriage with the heathen? Why is that the example that he chose? I think there's several reasons, but I want to hear what you guys have to think first. Why is the example of Solomon such a perfect example for the children of Israel at this point? Any thoughts?
Well, one of the first things in Solomon's reign was that he built the temple, the first temple.
Yep.
And here the people are rebuilding the temple with Ezra. So there's that parallel as one.
So I want to expound on that just a little bit. So they're building the temple. Solomon also built a temple. Was the temple that they built as great and as awesome as the temple that Solomon built? So they feel like in some ways they're taking a back seat to Solomon in building the temple. He was a greater king who built a greater temple, lived in a greater time. He was also one of the most wise people to have ever lived. So think about this for a second. Nehemiah is comparing the children of Israel to Solomon and saying, in effect, implicitly, he's saying, did you build a temple that's as great as Solomon's? No. Are you as wise as Solomon? No. Are you as rich as Solomon? No. Do you have as much influence and power as Solomon? No. Do you think that you will be able to marry heathen wives and do any better than Solomon did? No. This is the perfect example to use at this time and in this circumstance. Because any way you compare the nation of Israel now to the nation of Israel in Solomon's time, it takes a back seat by any metric. In any way that any individual leader of Israel compared himself to Solomon, he had to take a back seat. And yet Solomon was brought down by the very thing that these people claimed that they could withstand, and that is marrying idolatrous women. Any thoughts on this? Does it make sense? Sort of. Cool. Anybody want to add something that I missed or that I didn't miss, but I should have missed? No? Everybody's so quiet this morning. I think like when there's fewer people, we're all more scared because we feel like more people are looking at us whenever we talk, which is weird because there's actually less people looking at you whenever you talk, but you think that there's more people because there's less people in between you and the other people who are looking at you. Anyways, I've been in the audience. Okay.
I'm just thinking about, I've read recently about Baal Peor
Mm-hmm.
and what happened there with the foreign women coming in as friends, and then they fell to that.
Right.
And in that chapter, it's talking about how that's going to be happening here at the end of time again. And you're talking about the temple being built, and I'm thinking about how us as a church, we're representing the temple as a people.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering what the parallels are there, and how maybe we should be careful now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because not only are we restoring focus to the sanctuary as the Adventist people, but we're also repairing the breach, right? And we're also living in a time in which we've basically come out of captivity, with the whole Protestant movement bringing people out of Babylon. So there are a lot of parallels, and I really haven't had the time to explore that in my mind or study that through, but I think it is interesting and applicable that, and probably reasonable, that Satan would use some of the same methods to ensnare and entrap and entice us as God's people in the end of time as he did then. Right here. Where's the microphone? Oh, did you raise your hand? I'm so sorry. Did somebody else raise their hand? Oh, right here. Forgive me.
You start comparing that Solomon and that time,
Yeah.
and I start thinking Solomon didn't divorce the wives, but the children of Israel was divorced, and the temple was bigger and beautiful that Solomon was, but the temple is not. But Jesus was, preaching that temple. So
Right.
sometimes we feel that the great is great, but the person who humble is more God can use and much closer to God, and God can, live. This is what I learned,
Yeah.
the comparison.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Any other thoughts? I'm going to watch for more definite hand raisers so I don't call on people who weren't wanting to be called on. Sorry. Any other thoughts on Solomon and his example and why it was used, or anything else? There's a few other passages that we can look at. I don't think we have time to look at all of them that talk about the danger of intermarriage with those who do not believe in God. But we'll look at a few of them. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6 and verses 1 through 4. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Who would like to read that for us? Can I have a volunteer to read Genesis 6, 1 through 4?
Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown.
It's really interesting because leading up to this story, you see kind of the genealogies of two separate lines being laid out in the Bible. Those who followed God, the descendants of Seth, and those who did not follow God, the descendants of Cain. And what we have happening here in Genesis chapter 6 is those two groups coming together and intermarrying. And there's a few points that I think are really interesting here. Verse 1 of chapter 6, it says, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, that this happened. I don't know for sure, but it almost seems like there maybe was an overpopulation problem. Verse 2, it says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair. That's a really, really interesting thing to say. You would think that the daughters of God, or in other words, the daughters of the line of Seth, would be just as attractive, if not more so, than those of the people who weren't following God. But you know, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. And it does seem that sometimes those who do not care about eternal reality sometimes spend more time focusing on their temporal attractiveness. And so the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And right after this, what happens? The flood. Verse 3, and the Lord says, my spirit will not always strive with man, for he also is flesh. So in other words, God's probationary time for mankind seemed to be running out a lot faster when God's people started to intermarry with the idolatrous nations. Whenever you see this happening, there seems to be a direct and strong response from God. Why is that? Any thoughts? Here with the flood, in the story of Nehemiah, with the rebukes and the public beatings and all that kind of stuff, why is there always such a direct and firm response whenever intermarriage starts to occur? Is that a hand? Okay, a kind of hand. We'll see if we can get a kind of comment. No, I'm just kidding.
Kind of comment here.
I'm just messing.
When people intermarry and they are of different faiths, usually the one that's, let's say, a non-Christian tends to drag the Christian down. And so there are some cases where it goes the other way, but by far I've heard it goes the other way. Right. So that's the thing that God's really concerned about here.
Right. Why is that? Why is it that it generally tends to go in the wrong direction? Any thoughts?
Because we're sinful.
Because we're sinful? Yeah? Doc? Human nature. Mm-hmm.
And so when you appeal to the human nature, you're more likely to respond to it.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's just natural. It's going to go that direction because of, the unconverted spouse is going to always be driven more by the limbic system. And, and that can have a powerful influence on someone who also wasn't converted enough to make a decision to marry a godly individual. Right. So it's going to be like 99% the way that our brother just described it.
Yeah. I think that's a big part of it. I think also, Ellen White in the book Great Controversy describes the time in which the Sunday law is passed in the United States. And she talks about how when someone is living a life that they know is wrong, that they feel obligated to compel those around them to do the same, to seek affirmation. When you're living a life that is right, when you're living a life that is in accordance with what you know to be right, you don't feel like you have to force or compel anybody else around you to live as you live. Now, that doesn't mean you don't want to help other people, but when you're living a life that you know to be wrong, you have a lot more motivation to coerce other people around you into living the way you do so that you feel affirmed in the way that you live. And I think this kind of applies to intermarriages. I think sometimes the spouse that is not converted, that is not a Christian, may be feeling conviction and therefore is tempted to try to stifle that conviction by pulling the other spouse down. Any other thoughts on why intermarriage is dangerous, intermarriage between, godly and ungodly is dangerous, and why God responds in such firm ways when that becomes widespread?
Well, we all know that when you marry someone, you don't marry just that one person.
It's true.
You have the whole family that's influencing you as well.
And so now you've connected yourself with not only one person who could potentially influence you negatively, but a whole group. Any other thoughts?
I think another thing you have to consider when you marry someone of a different faith is the children. I remember as a kid, my dad staying at home and my mom trying to get us all ready to go to Sabbath School, and it's just really awkward. And it's not good for the children. And the children end up often they don't have as good of an example in both parents.
Right. And there's always going to be some degree of difference, because two people getting married are two individuals. There's always going to be some degree of difference religiously and spiritually in how they see things and how they think things should be done. But the greater that difference is, and especially when it's significant enough to mean that they're actually part of two different faith communities, the bigger that difference is, the more problems that it's going to cause. Let's read a couple more verses. Let's go over to Genesis chapter 24. Genesis chapter 24, and we'll read verse 1 through 4. Genesis chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. If I could have a volunteer to read that passage in the back.
Now Abraham was old, advanced in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in every way. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he owned, "Please place your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live. But you shall go to my country and to my relatives and take a wife for my son Isaac."
It's kind of interesting to me that one of the dying wishes, as it were, of Abraham was that his son get a suitable wife. It wasn't, take care of this or take care of that, or, make sure you bury me here, or it was make sure that you find my son a wife that shares the same faith. It was pretty important to Abraham. It was something that he valued enough that he made his servant to swear, to promise that he would fulfill this thing. Couple more verses. Genesis chapter 28. Genesis chapter 28. And verse 1 and 2. And I'll read that. Genesis chapter 28, verse 1 and 2. So now this is Isaac, who's up in years. Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said unto him, "Thou shalt not take a wife of the daughter of Canaan. Arise, go to Padanaram," however you say that, Padanaram, "to the house of Bethuel, thy mother's father, and take thee a wife from thence of the daughters of Laban, thy mother's brother." So when Abraham was about to die, he wanted to make sure that his son had a godly wife. Now, Isaac wants to make sure that Jacob also has a godly wife. This seemed to be something that was very important to the early patriarchs, because they recognized that without a suitable wife, one that was of the same faith community, the line of messianic succession could not continue, and the heritage of theology could not be passed down. And that's why when Nehemiah comes to this intermarriage, this time of corruption and idolatry entering Israel through the form of intermarriage, that's why he's so stern. That's why he's so on fire to correct this problem? Any other thoughts? Any other thoughts? In the back. Excuse me.
I'm not entirely sure how to get this thought across. I think it applies all the way back to the daughters or the sons of God marrying the daughters of men, and to Abraham and to Nehemiah's situation. Which combination is better for following generations? A godly man and a not so godly wife, or a godly wife and a not so godly man? Which one are you likely to have godly children from? And I suspect it's the one where you have a godly wife. The mother has such a tremendous influence on the children. And I think that may be why in all these cases, I mean, we can say it's paternal society or culture and so forth, and so you talk about men marrying pagan women, but I think it also reflects the fact that if a godly man marries a not so godly wife, there's a much stronger likelihood that the following generation is not going to be good. So, that may play into it as well.
Wow, interesting. A thought right here?
That's interesting too. But I'm thinking about Eli and Aaron and how they were reprimanded in a very serious way. Their children died because it says that he didn't do what he should do.
Right.
So I don't know. That's just a thought. And then the other thought that I had was how interesting the line of Messiah is, that he, there's Rahab in there.
Yeah.
There's people who wouldn't
you wouldn't
appear
expect,
to be godly wives, but
Right.
really were, because God got into their hearts.
Right. Interesting. And I think you bring out a good point. Not only is the role of the mother very important, but the role of the father is important as well. It's kind of hard to quantify which one's more important, but they're both they're both pretty important. Any other thoughts on this, or else we probably need to move on because we're running out of time. Let's skip down to, wow, we didn't get very far. Let's skip down to Thursday's lesson. Thursday's lesson basically asks the question, how do we apply all of this today? How do we apply principles about intermarriage, and should we be doing public beatings for people who have got intermarried with non-Adventists? How do we apply this today? That's the question that Thursday's lesson asks. And to answer that question, it goes to the New Testament, to the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 10 through 17. I guess we can read that, but we can break it up if not one person wants to read the whole thing. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10 through 17. We're going to find out what Paul's general counsel is about how to deal with intermarriages.
So 1 Corinthians 7, 10 through 17, this is the ESV. To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, not I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches.
So far, up until this point, we've been reading a lot of kind of discouraging stuff, especially stuff that would come across as discouraging if someone happened to be in a relationship or in a marriage that was less than ideal, that was not how God intended it to be. But as the lesson brings out here from 1 Corinthians, there is hope for one of the spouses to reach the other. There is hope that the godly spouse can win and reach the ungodly spouse. Yes, it's likely that the ungodly spouse can pull the other down, but there is still hope. And what is the counsel that's given here in 1 Corinthians, the general counsel that's given specifically, as it says, by the command of God in verse 10? That counsel is not to divorce just because your spouse is ungodly, unconverted, or unchristian. The counsel is, if they leave you, so be it. But if possible, stay together with them. So how do we reconcile this passage in 1 Corinthians, with the story we've read where God comes down very hard on intermarriages in Israel, and as we should have got to if we had had more time, eventually asked for a lot of those marriages to be broken up? How do we reconcile these two passages?
I wonder if this was the case of a conversion once they were already married.
So does that mean...
So one became a Christian and
Right.
the other one was not, but they didn't marry that way.
So does that mean if a Christian marries a non-Christian that they should get divorced?
I'm not going to.
Okay. Sorry, I put people on the spot too often. There could be that differentiation. Any other thoughts?
Good morning. I think it is implied that the spouse that doesn't believe consents to live in the house of the believer. That means that the person doesn't oppose to the things that the believer will do. And I have seen cases like that. An Adventist marries a non-Adventist, but the non-Adventist tells the spouse, I will not I will let you put our children in a Seventh-day Adventist school.
Right.
So it consents to be in the house of the believer. It's not against the beliefs.
Interesting.
So that I think that makes a big difference in that case.
Right. Any other thoughts? How do we reconcile and understand these two passages in the light of each other? There's a couple things that I think can help us to understand this. First of all, as the lesson pointed out in, let me refresh my memory, I think it was Tuesday's lesson or Wednesday's lesson. The Hebrew words that were used for putting away of the wives in Ezra 10 did not signify divorce, but rather signified that Ezra did not see these couples as legally married in the first place, because the Mosaic law prohibited the marriage with the heathen, and therefore Ezra didn't see these marriages as legitimate in the first place, so he didn't see it as divorce. That's perhaps one part of understanding this. And the other part of understanding this is that it seems that Jesus kind of tightened the rules about divorce in the New Testament. Wow, I guess I better hurry up. In the Old Testament, there were a variety of conditions under which one could seek a divorce. But in the New Testament, Jesus only gives one criteria for seeking divorce. And what is that? Adultery, marital unfaithfulness. And so it would seem that under that definition of when divorce is appropriate, that the only conclusion you have is what we have here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where unless the unbelieving spouse chooses to leave and to remarry, you're not free to divorce and to remarry yourself.
There's one more place in the Old Testament that speaks about divorce, and that's in Malachi 2. And it's interesting to compare this verse with Ezra and Nehemiah because it might have been about the same time. And it says, in verse 13, you cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping and crying. So he does not regard the offering anymore, nor receive it with goodwill from your hands. Yet you say, for what reason? Because the Lord has been witness between you and the wife of your youth, with whom you have dealt treacherously, and yet she is your companion and your wife by covenant. But did he not make them one, having a remnant of the Spirit? And why one? He seeks godly offspring. Therefore take heed to your spirit, and let none deal treacherously with the wife of his youth. For the Lord God of Israel says that he hates divorce, for it covers one's garment with violence.
Interesting. Even at this time in which drastic measure was taken, it's clear that God did not see divorce as a good thing. In fact, it says that he hated divorce. Any other thoughts before we summarize and then?
I was thinking about Queen Esther, well, before she was queen, and her uncle wanted her to save their people by becoming the queen. But the king had put his wife away because she came out and danced and he didn't like it. He put her away, and that was the end of her. So how did she marry this king and not be living in adultery according to the Bible? I mean, that's just something I've always questioned. I don't understand that. But I believe God was certainly the one that orchestrated that to save his people. But how does that work?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I think probably is outside the scope of the time we have today. But if you look at the story of Hosea, Hosea is called to marry a prostitute, right? It doesn't seem that the biblical injunction not to commit adultery makes it absolute that you, how do I say this? If I marry someone who is unfaithful to me, I am not necessarily the one guilty of committing adultery. The other person is, right? So in the story of Hosea with the prostitute was a sinner and was sinning by being a prostitute and by being immoral. But Hosea was not necessarily sinning by marrying her. And I think that similar idea could be applied to the story of Esther and the king, although I think I would have to study and think about it a little more before I would stake very much on that opinion. Any other thoughts on this or anything else before we summarize and close up for the day? Because I've heard the bells, the Christmas bells. No, not the Christmas bells, the Sabbath School bells. Any other thoughts? Okay. So sorry.
I guess I would just say that in such a topic, I think that one of the important things to remember is that ultimately, in all of this, what God truly is wanting and desiring is for the best for his people.
Absolutely.
And for their happiness, and what will allow not just peace and harmony on earth, but preparation for eternity.
Right. And I think that's so important to keep in mind. We can discuss the kind of theoretical nuances of when divorce is appropriate and who you should marry and all of these things. But at the very heart of it is God's desire for us to be happy, for us to be at peace, as you're saying. And so that means when somebody has made a mistake, when somebody has made a choice that either they shouldn't have or that they regret later, when someone is in that situation, we don't need to come down hard on them in most cases and say, oh, wow, you terrible person, you did this and this and this. But rather, we want to be in a position where we want to help them to reach that peace, that joy that you're describing. Because we've all made mistakes. We've all done things that we're not proud of. We've all done things that have hurt us later on down the road. And we all need the healing grace of God help us with that. And since I've heard the bells multiple times now, I think I'm going to wrap it up so that we all have some time to get a drink and stuff before church. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, Lord, I thank you so much that you've given us so many interesting stories and so much good counsel about how to live our lives, how to interact with the complex and complicated world in which we live. And I want to pray that you will help each of us to take that counsel to heart, not to live in a way that either violates that counsel or that unnecessarily tries to push that counsel on people who are not ready to hear it, but rather in a way that preserves the integrity of the culture that you want within your church, but also, as was just mentioned, leads to the peace and happiness of the individuals both within and without as much as possible. I thank you so much, and I pray these things in Jesus' name.